In this video, I discussed with Professor Dennett the theory of extended mind and extended cognition that was first proposed by Andy Clark and David Chalmers in 1998. The theory says that our cognition is not simply realized by our brain processes, but rather it's realized by the interaction between brain, body, and word. In particular, the theory says that when we use an external artifact that is deeply integrated on a functional phenomenological level with our brain processes, we can say that that part of the word, that tool, is a part of our mind and our cognition, because its contribution is fundamental in realizing the cognitive process. The original thought experiment proposed by Clark and Chalmers considered a subject called Otto, suffering from Alzheimer, using a notebook to store his memories and to guide his behavior when he needs to access these memories. And they consider, for example, the belief that MoMA is located at 53rd Street in New York City. So when Otto wants to go to MoMA, he simply accesses his notebook and then retrieves the information of the address and directly goes to the place. According to Clark and Chalmers, this is an instance of extended mind. The critics of this theory argue that it doesn't make sense to say that the external tool is a part of our mind or of our cognition. We can simply say that is causally contributing to the process, but is not a constitutive part of the process. So the debate between the embedded view and the extended view is this one. So the embedded view says that the external artifact is merely causally contributing to our cognitive processes, while the extended view says that it's not simply causally contributing, but that causal contribution in this case, in particular circumstances, is a constitutive contribution. Thank you for Professor Dennett for this chat. It's a pleasure and an honor to speak with you. So I want to, we can discuss about the extended mind theory. Mm-hmm. I think that, in my thesis, I present what I call the extended view against Adams and Aizawa intrinsic view. And I think there are many similarities between Adams and Aizawa and, for example, Searle, commitment. And on the other hand, Andy Clark, that is one of the major proponents of the theory of extended mind, always is committed, not always, but is often committed to your view, for example. So in some way, you're not the father of the extended view, but your view deeply influenced the extended view. And sometimes you're also considered one of the first proponents in 1996 when you said that we tend to offload our mind into object. And So I want to ask you first if you think that the extended view debate is it's something that is fruitful in some way, or rather the distinction between embedded cognition or extended cognition. At one point, it doesn't make sense. It's just a matter of a terminological difference. Or do we need a sort of ontological commitment to which we can say, no, the extended view is true, or rather a better theory rather than the embedded view for some specific cases?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure that I have a good answer. Mm-hmm. My first reaction is that these efforts at definition are usually counterproductive. They end up with a lot of counterexample mongering and nitpicking, and that what we should recognize is that minds are not things like rubies or diamonds, and they're not even things like brains. They're things like brains that have wonderful varieties of thinking tools installed on them, apps, software, and that's what a mind really is. And where it leaves off and the next one begins, to take a very close example. A few feet away from me is the office of Teresa Salvato, my assistant, my program assistant. And there's lots of things that I do that I couldn't do without her, and she's the one who does them and knows how to do them, and I just delegate them. I offload them to her. We say, yes, but that doesn't make her mind part of your. Well, try to draw the line, and you'll find all sorts of embarrassments.
Yeah, I try to draw the line in my thesis because when we try to mix minds, like different individuals' mind, not just we mix my mind with an artifact, but your mind with your assistant mind, this can create more problems than solution, we can say, I think, because I think we should draw a boundary between extended cognition and distributed cognition. So I think that your example is an example of distributed cognition across different individuals, that they can have their own mind, right? But there is no an extended system Dennett plus assistant that exists on itself, right? So this is an example of distributed cognition, and when we try to overlap distributed cognition with extended cognition, many critics says, well, there is a problem of, like, there is no entity without identity. So how can we define when two minds becomes one or other? So I think that distributed cognition can be interesting, but we should distinguish this thesis from the extended cognition. And this is what I do in my thesis, because I try to define cognition starting from an evolutionary perspective. So if you are committed to the thesis that you plus your assistant are an extended mind, you should offer, like, I don't know, maybe evolutionary reasons. We can say, the first say, like group selection. So you are an extended entity selected by evolution in some way. But if you can't do it, it's better to just be committed to an extended cognition hypothesis and considering cognition a product of evolution that can be biological, cultural, or even technological in some way, but that is organism-bounded, not organism-bounded, organism-centered. Organism-centered, but not organism-bounded, as Andy Clark says.
Yeah, I'm not convinced. I think there are all sorts of collaborations between people that are possible. My collaboration with Teresa is one. My collaboration with, say, Keith Frankish, or with Nicholas Humphrey, or somebody else with whom I'm writing something, that can be a much more, the product can be much more uniform, much more unified, and it can be something that neither of us could have produced by ourselves.
Okay. Well, you're saying an interesting thing, the fact that the collaboration of different minds creates an emergent phenomenon that is not reducible to the individual entities linearly combined together in some way. You're saying this, right?
Well, yes, they obviously, in one sense.
Well, this is one of the...
There's a process that happened.
Yeah.
But it saying who's made which contribution is, in the end, I think, a foolish endeavor. Yeah.
So this is the criterion of an emergent system, a non-aggregate system using Wismar conception of emergence, is what you're proposing, and this is one of the criteria I use to define when an extended cognitive process is extended rather than just embedded. I mean, I know, I'm not the only one. I'm using Clark. I'm using mostly Clark view, but the aim of my thesis is to try to find an intermediate solution between Clark's view that I call it matrix of cognition, and Rowland's manipulative definition of cognitive processes. So I define Clark's perspective a matrix of cognition account because he doesn't...
There's a word you use there.
Matrix.
Matrix.
Yeah, matrix is Italian, sorry.
Yeah.
We say matrix, but is matrix, right? Matrix because he doesn't use a mark of cognition, because he has a motley conception of cognition. Cognition is an ensemble of a variety of motley different processes. So how can we offer a mark that defines all these processes? I agree with this view that is very difficult to find a mark, and in some way it can be a chauvinistic mark, because if we choose one specific sort of cognition as the real one, then this is arbitrary in some way, no? So rather he uses what they call a matrix of cognition account, and I try to define his view using your theory of of intuition pumps, right? You use this conception that when we do a thought experiment, we can use intuition pumps to set the parameters of each dimension on a specific way, and we can say the result, right? The same goes for cognition. We can set the different parameters like the level, the time of the processing, the level of trust in your own cognitive processes, the transparency, the informational flow. So all of these are like dimension of the metrics of cognition. And what Clark says is that when we posit extended cognitive system, even if some dimensional parameters are set on different parameters rather than on a self-contained cognitive system, this doesn't disqualify the extended system as cognitive just because some parameters, such as the level of trust, can be different from the other one. So this is, what do you think about this, like, conceptualization of?
Well, I think it's fine. I just think that it may be that you're pounding on an open door.
Yeah, I mean,
I guess I would say Clark and Chalmers and the extended mind, they had some good points to make, and distributed cognition, and Hutchins, they has some good points to make, and they all fit together, and it's related to a point I make in at the end of From Bacteria to Bach and Back, that we can have distributed comprehension. That maybe nobody, McGinn and Chomsky say the human brain just cannot understand itself. Well, maybe a single human brain can't, but a bunch of them can. And we can distribute the understanding. And if we have trust, I think it's very important that you raise trust.
Another important dimension is not just trust, but is, I think, like responsibility. So this is Haugeland's account of original intentionality. He binds original intentionality to responsibility. So a system must take responsibility for its all and own well-functioning. And I add this, I define this a condition. So Clark and Chalmers use the glue and trust condition. They added also the past endorsement condition. And I add other two conditions for a proper coupling between a human, just a cognizer, and an extended source of cognition, like a device. Because critics says, well, and this is a point I want to discuss with you, the external device has just derived intentionality. So when you like offload, for example, a notebook with your personal information, this is just a tool that you are using. Of course, you are offloading your informational content on that tool, on that device, but this doesn't make the tool a proper part of your mind. And I rely on Clark, what I call like integrated system reply. That is basically the same reply that you and other offer to Searle Chinese room argument. I think there are many similarities, because also in that case, the system reply says, when we posit a system, then the part that is integrated to the system is offering a genuine contribution to the well-functioning of the system. So if there is, of course, even if we admit that there is a distinction between original intentionality in my mind and the derived intentionality into the notebook, then when we create a system that takes responsibility for its proper integration of information, because we can say, well, while in my mind, when I have to update a belief, this is a subpersonal update and is automatic. Okay. While if you have to update a belief in your notebook, this can create set of contradictory beliefs between what you have in your mind and what you have in your notebook. But first point is that many people have set of contradictory beliefs in their own mind. And if we posit this coupling condition in which the system must take responsibility for its proper functioning, this proper functioning can happen on a subpersonal level, or also on a personal editing of the notebook. This is just the same. I can reason and also only with my mind and think, oh, I should update my set of beliefs because there are some wrong and there are some mistakes in my set of beliefs. So the fact that it's not subpersonal but is conscious delivered, conscious controlled, doesn't disqualify to be a cognitive process. So the same can be externalized with a notebook. And I think that if we add the condition of responsibility of the system, this can offer an adequate response to the one that says they disqualify the notebook only because it has derived intentionality.
Yeah, there's a lot in what you've just said. I'm going to just unpack a little part of it. One of the best ways of trying to take responsibility is to talk to yourself, to ask yourself what you really believe and try to be your own critic. And this process of talking to yourself, whether it's out loud or sotto voce, or
it's like Socrates' dialogue as a narrator.
You can do it silently in your own head. I think we have to look closely at the role that process plays, because we tend to take it for granted. One of the points that I've made recently is that there can be what I call a Popperian
animal
creature, which tries things out in its head before deciding on the right one. But it doesn't have to know that it's a Popperian creature. It doesn't have to be conscious of or understand the rationale. It's just the beneficiary of this process.
This is the distinction between a representation for the creature and a representation of the creature.
Yeah. Yes, I guess it is. We, human beings, because of our reflectiveness, our recursive capacity to reflect and reflect and reflect, we take this to new levels, completely unknown, I think, to all other creatures. And that is a huge source. That's the source of not just morality, but science, art, music, culture. All the things that we do that other creatures don't do depend on this higher order reflection. And the higher order reflection can be divided up into different categories. What you and I are doing right now, right this minute, is a kind of higher order reflection, where you are playing a role that I could play for myself. I could question myself. I could try things out on myself the way you're trying things out on me. In fact, we're collaborating, using two brains to work on one topic at the same time. Another time I might use a notebook, and I might write things down in the notebook or make a sketch, try to draw a diagram. One of the most interesting days in my life theorizing about consciousness was when I was making a film for the BBC, a video program about my book, Consciousness Explained. And I had a young and aggressive producer-director of this program, the Antenna program. And I didn't agree with her about many of her decisions about how to present the material. But one thing she did do, at one point, and she filmed me saying this, I was very disparaging about somebody's diagram of consciousness and I said, what was wrong with it? And she said, what's your diagram? And at that point, I hadn't tried to draw a diagram. And when I tried to draw a diagram, an architecture, I was forced to recognize that there were questions that I needed to answer that I hadn't thought about, that I couldn't draw the diagram for. And it was a very useful exercise, drawing diagrams of what my theory said.
Yeah, I did it. In my thesis, I have some diagrams because I think they're very useful to externalize what you have in your own mind on an external medium. It helps a lot to understand it.
I don't know why. I think that the philosophers' disdain for diagrams and figures is a big mistake.
I find it very useful, and in some way, studying for my thesis and writing my thesis, I apply what I am arguing for in some way, because I use different sorts of medium, I use paper, I use my computer, I use Remarkable, and I explain things to other people to have feedbacks. So basically, I'm using the same the concept that I am arguing for. I use them to study for my thesis as well.
The idea that I would have to be convinced that there's a principled difference between the following cases drawn from extremes in a continuum. I've got eyeglasses and now hearing aids. That's part of my extended mind in one sense, but it's, of course, these are really very straightforward mechanistic systems for simply enhancing my capacities to see and hear. My notebook, which I take notes in, is a little different, but not much, because it's a prosthesis of memory. But it is also something that I can look back at. And then to take another case, fast photography was a fantastic epistemological advance, because it meant that we could study at our own pace processes that happen too fast to see otherwise. Film, video, all of these technologies create new thinking tools in a very important sense. And the technologies are not just physical technologies. They're thinking tools like algorithms and cost-benefit analysis and Bayesian reasoning. These are all technologies. Language itself is a technology.
But do you think, of course, language is considered by Clark and some proponents of the extended view as the fundamental extending tool that is basically culture, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, from matter of scope, I don't treat it in my thesis, but there is a fundamental difference concerning language from your view and Clark's view, I think, because in some way you consider language as a reprogramming device of our brains, right? So while I think that Clark has a view of language as more than an external medium rather than a transforming brain process. Of course, it transforms our brains, but maybe the difference of focus between your view and Clark's view is this one. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think maybe that's right. I'll have to think about it a bit more, but I've always been impressed by the demands that language puts on our brains, and the fact that learning to express ourselves and to become accurate and careful and vivid expressors of our thoughts, this is a huge part of becoming a good thinker. I've recently been recommending a book by the Israeli linguist Daniel Dennett. It's called The Instruction of Imagination. It's all about language. It's all about language learning and how it changes our minds. I think he's got one of the best. he's not sufficiently Darwinian, but otherwise, he has some very good things to say about how language shapes our minds.
Well, do you think that, I mean, we have discussed about many different ways to extend our minds, language, culture, technology. One of the critique is, well, can we have a unified explanatory framework for all these different medium? I mean, we risk to have, there are two options. We don't pursue a unified explanatory framework because it's impossible, or we try to find an explanatory framework that encompasses all these different processes, medium, and mechanisms. Do you think, what solution do you prefer? And if you think that there can be a unified framework, should be it functionalism or the extended version of functionalism?
Yeah, yes. And I think it's not hard to see how this will unify. Because functionalism has this great virtue, is that it permits the fungibility of parts. And if one part drops out, I can find another that will maybe do the same job. I mean, I am firmly convinced that teaching at Tufts is the best thing for me. Instead of just teaching graduate students, I've had undergraduates in virtually all my classes. Very seldom that I have a class that doesn't have any undergraduates. And I think having to teach undergraduates has compelled me to clarify my expression, to simplify my expression, to, when I see a blank stare from an undergraduate, it goads me into action. I've got to explain to that person.
Do you think that this has improved also your like writing skills, because you write wonderful books? And
not just writing, my thinking skills. Yeah, absolutely. I think, in fact, my general rule of thumb, I tell my fellow experts, whatever you're working on, if you can't explain it to a bright undergraduate, you don't understand it. And I've yet to encounter, well, I think, no, I'll back off on that and say, I know mathematicians who understand things about, I don't know, group theory or category theory or topology that are almost impossible to explain to a bright undergraduate who isn't a math major. And I think they understand what they're doing, but those are at the limit.
Well, you said functionalism is the best framework, and I tend to agree, but also functionalism has its drawbacks too. So one of the problems of functionalism is the famous also called boundary problem. So how we select the real realizer of the mental state or the cognitive kind or whatever of the property or and so on. So the problem of functionalism is that is the same with causation in some way. So when we say this has caused that, well, this contributed to many other things to cause that. For example, I embrace a Mackey view of inus causation. So there are many different contributions to a specific effect. So the same goes for functionalism and for the relation between realizer and what is realized, right? So I think one way to solve the boundary problem of functionalism, so how we distinguish and draw the line between what is the realizer and what is the contribution to this realization and what is the background condition, for example, is like the distinction between co-realizer, total realizer, and background condition offered by Robert Wilson, for example, in his book. So, do you know this framework? The problem of the boundary problem, do you know it?
Not as such, no.
The boundary problem is when we say, for example, the function of the heart is to pump blood. Okay. So we can say the heart is the co-realizer of this function, but the heart doesn't operate on its own. He needs a system. So there is the total realizer of this system that can be considered the circulatory system or the entire organism, that is the total realizer of this function. And then there are the background condition, because the heart can pump blood only if there is oxygen into the atmosphere. So we don't want to say that the oxygen is part of the realizer of the pumping blood function, but we can just say that it's a background condition. So the same goes for when we talk about mental states. So how can we draw the boundary between what is actually contributing to the realization of that mental state? Because if we embrace an internalist view, it's simple. We say neural states realize mental states, and that's it. And in this way, the realizer are identified. But the point is that this identification can be considered arbitrary, because if there is a wide realization, we can have a wide realization. So there are two opposites. The so-called cognitive bloat, that is, okay, everything contributes to the realization of my mental state, and there's so-called cognitive implosion. So only neurons, or only one specific neuron, as an absurd reduction ad absurdum, realize this state. So how can we find the intermediate solution between cognitive bloat and cognitive implosion? I think that this framework is difficult to define it properly, because it is context dependent, of course.
So why define it?
Why?
Why do you want to define it then?
And because if we embrace functionalism, there is the boundary problem that has to be faced and solved in some way.
Why does it have to be faced?
So that your theory is strong.
Well, but other theories seem to have the same problem, and they don't bother.
Okay. So I should say, in this part of the thesis, I don't bother about this problem. I just go on.
Well, I think you should think about it and realize that philosophers love to create requirements that are dubious. And it may not be important to come up with no biologist thinks it's worth her time to come up with a absolutely foolproof, leak-proof, counterexample-proof definition of gene or wolf.
Yeah.
So forget it.
Yeah. Okay.
We often don't need to define our terms that perfectly in order to make progress. And I know that in my career, I've encountered lots of philosophers, even some quite famous philosophers. That's what they do. They try to think of counterexamples. And that's their shtick. That's what they do. And they make almost no progress on any topic, but they have great fun stopping people in their tracks by demanding definitions that can't be forthcoming, that they can't come up with a counterexample to. And I think it's time to recognize that for what it is, which is a sort of mindless algorithm for postponing progress.
Okay, interesting your view. Well, in my thesis, I discuss also the problem of bodily constitution, and there is this your famous thought experiment from 1981, I think, where am I? Sorry. So this is interesting because there is the detachment from the controller and the controlled body. So you philosophize and try to think about this kind of relations. And there are many experiments actually that started in the late 90s and in the first 2000 concerning bodily constitution, bodily ownership and stuff like that. So in my thesis, I analyze this kind of research because Clark uses this research to say, well, when we use a tool, we are not just using a tool, as the critic would say, because in many cases we literally incorporate this tool into our body schema or into our body image. So the body schema is a subpersonal representation of the brain that the brain does of the body, while the body image is a conscious concept. So how we conceive ourselves as embodied systems. So And there is this, I think that I wanted to like complement and to complete Clarke's account of bodily constitution, because he only appeals to these two notions. But I think that I added another, I studied the literature, and there is this other notion of body model that is a normative notion, that the body model is this subpersonal representation that the brain has, and it incorporates tools only under specific circumstances, such as a prosthesis, for example. So a prosthesis, it's something that sticks with the agent, not as a pen that you use only sometime and you extend your body into the pen only for a brief period of time. But when you use a prosthesis, there is this extension also on a more deeper level. So the point is...
And you think that's a sharp line?
No, I don't think, I don't think there is a sharp line. I don't think that there is also in this case a continuum of incorporation. So we can use different subpersonal or personal criteria to say, in this case, surely there is no incorporation, or in this case, surely there is incorporation. So for example, if a prosthesis respects all these criteria, so the three, like body schema, body image, and body model, but also a phenomenological commitment to that part of the body. So if you really feel that that part of the body is a part of you, because you can't live without it, and you always operate through it, and not just using it, but you operate through it. Now, this is the difference between using a tool and operating through a tool. So I think that in this way, when we have this complete account of bodily constitution, we can also offer another reason against the embedded view, because when you incorporate a tool on a so profound level, maybe we don't have like a scientific reason, but at least, for example, an ethical reason to say that this is an extended system. So I think I wanted to ask you, for example, so if there is not just scientific reasons or explanatory reasons to be committed to the extended view, but also ethical reasons, because if you consider a tool as a part of this of an agent, then these has also ethical consequences. So given the fact that from an empirical perspective, the extended view and embedded view, there is an empirical underdetermination of the theory, so we can choose whether to choose one or the other one. So many proponents says, well, we should just use ethical reasons to support the extended view. So what do you think about it? So, my account of body constitution was just one of the ingredients of this bigger view that we should be committed also to ethical reasons to embrace the extended view.
For me, the ethical reason that looms large is, I think that with AI, talk about prostheses, with AI coming along, we're in a position where more and more, say, doctors are delegating authority to the systems they're using instead of making their own judgment. Or it takes a brave doctor to overrule a fancy AI system diagnosis. Maybe a brave and foolish doctor. I think we want to maintain that the doctors are morally responsible for the decisions that they make when they rely on these prostheses. And I think that's a huge requirement, actually. I think we have to say that if a doctor, say, or any other professional relies on the judgment of an AI system to make a decision and endorses it, we hold the professional person responsible, morally responsible. We do not allow them to duck behind the claim, well, the machine misled me. No, you're responsible for not being misled by the machine. That's a very, very high standard of responsibility. A lot of people would not be willing to undertake that level of responsibility. Okay, then they shouldn't do those jobs. It's a risky thing to do. I think we should really make people worry about the decisions they make on the basis of advice they get from AI systems. And this, in turn, will mean that they will seek out liability insurance, and the insurance companies will then make their rates dependent on how well they judge the companies that are making the devices. It has a knock-on effect where it will raise the level of responsibility across the board.
Yeah, but I mean, if I understand correctly what you're saying, I think that this goes in the opposite direction that the one I was proposing, because I was saying that if you say that the notebook is part of me, okay, and a person steal that notebook, if we buy the extended view, then for ethical and legal reasons, this is not just a theft of property, but you're taking a part of myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in this case, the extended system is the one that gets harmed. Okay, but you are saying we are proposing another scenario in which the doctor plus the AI take a decision, and you say we should consider only the doctor responsible for that decision, and in this way you're not committed to an extended system doctor plus AI, but you're just attributing responsibility to the doctor. So this is not an extended view, but rather a...
Well, it could cut that way, but it doesn't have to. We can hold the person who made the AI, the company that made the AI, we can assign responsibility there too. The important thing is that we have to make sure that there are always suitable objects, well, to put it very bluntly, suitable objects of punishment.
Okay.
I have this free will debate with Greg Caruso, where I say, look, I don't want to live in a world without punishment.
Yeah.
And this is shocking to many people, but I think the defense of it is pretty clear. And I want to hold people responsible.
Yeah.
And I will... holding people responsible can certainly include holding people that have extended minds responsible.
Well, to go back to what you're most expert with, like evolution. So I think that the extended mind, many proponents of the extended mind are committed to evolutionary argument to support it, like the argument from evolutionary efficiency that says that it's more efficient to rely on the environment and offload the structure of the environment with your own thoughts and practices, and not just cognition, but also like physiological processes. We rely on that when we cook food with fire, right? It's an extended digestive system in some way. So in some way, we can use evolution to support the extended view. And I think one notion that is crucial is the notion of exaptation. Because if you are committed to an intrinsic view that says only neurons are cognitive because only neurons are selected for cognition, and so this is their proper function, this is what they are selected for, and blah, blah, blah. So we are committed to a selectionist principle in which the intrinsic nature of something is defined only by the history of selection. But if we try to, if we expand this and we accept the notion of exaptation, for example, then it becomes acceptable that we use action perception loops, for example, combined with internal cognition plus external medium. Then in this way, the action perception extension of cognition can be considered an exaptation. I
think the term exaptation is almost a throwaway, but yes, you could have it. As I point out in Darwin's Dangerous Idea, Gould and Verba's term, every adaptation is an exaptation. So, big deal.
The difference
here's a nice example, maybe. A lot of the work done in deep learning depends on hardware that was initially developed for video games. So that's what it was designed for, but it turned out to be so brilliant for rendering three-dimensional worlds, for instance, that it was adapted and put to new uses in AI.
Yeah, the difference between exaptation and adaptation is the level of normativity of the practice, we can say. So if we have like a proper function, we are recognizing that it was developed for historical and selective reasons, and so he is supposed to function in that way, in some way. While in an exaptation, this sort of normativity is still absent. If this is a temporary soft assembled exaptation, which I do a new use of hold power, and this is a new exaptation, okay, right? So, I mean, exaptation becomes everything I do new, right? So there is the difference between an exaptation intended as so temporally soft assembled and an adaptation as the difference is the normative dimension of this practice.
Well, I don't know. It seems to me that the difference is only a matter of time.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm out of my sailboat and the mast breaks and I rig a temporary mast out of the spinnaker pole and everything and use that to save my life, that spinnaker pole has now been exapted to be a mast, which it does pretty darn well. And however long, maybe I've sailed a boat around the world for years with using the spinnaker pole as a mast. At what point does it become an adaptation and not an exaptation? Doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. So as for the boundary problem, basically it's a false problem. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in this way, so many problems.
I'm going to sing the same song every time.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this chat. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. And good luck with your thesis.
Thank you very much.
And you know that just about all my papers are on my website.
Yeah. And also, I will be eager to read your next book. So.
Yeah, very good.